The book we're reading today is titled Neil Flambée and the Marco Polo Murders, written by Kevin Sylvester. Neil Flambée is a 14-year-old chef who owns a small boutique restaurant, a very famous restaurant. He is particularly good because he has a keen sense of smell. He can smell anything, and he brags that he can cook anything in the world. He is very popular, not just because he's a great chef, but because in his free time he is a prime detective who always helps the police solve crack crimes, and especially related to anything related to smell, to food, to kitchen. And so this one is the first book of Neil Flambée, but we have many more. This is Neil Flambée and the Aztec Abduction. I want to read that one. And the Crusader's Curse. And the Tokyo Treasure. And we have more. Neil Flambée and the Bard's Banquet. Let's start. So we have a map here. Constantinople, Africa, Arabia, the journey of Marco Polo, the Gobi Desert, Dido, India. And let us begin. Prologue, Venice, 1324. Marco Polo lay on his deathbed, smiling weakly at the loved ones at his side. He tried to open his mouth to speak, but even that simple effort exhausted him. He lay still, wishing he had the energy to tell them that he was ready to go. He had lived a good life, a long life, a wealthy life. Marco had been the greatest explorer of his time, or any time before that. When he was barely a teenager, he traveled from his birthplace in Venice all the way to China. His uncle and father had asked him to join them on their search for more lucrative trading partners. Some had said he was too young to go on such adventure, but he'd ignored them. He wanted to see what lay outside the canals and counting houses of Venice. It had been the greatest decision of his life. The Polos had found gold and jewels and plenty of them. But Marco had discovered much more than that. He had seen that the world was an enormous and fascinating place. Marco coughed. The priest, mistaking it for a death rattle, leaned over at him expectantly. Marco smiled back faintly. He shook his head. "Not yet," he mouthed silently. The priest stood back up, bumping the bedside table and nearly toppling an ornate globe perched on a pile of well-worn books. The room was filled with such reminders of Marco's explorations. Strange maps and exotic works of art hung from the walls. Hundreds of books in dozens of languages lay scattered on every available surface. Marco's sheets and robes were woven Marco's sheets and robes were woven of the finest Chinese silk, decorated with scenes of his travels through Asia. Marco coughed again, and the Mongolian princesses, stitched into his collar, moved and swayed, sadly dancing in time to the rise and fall of his chest. Embroidered Persian camels marched up and down the length of the bed, reminding Marco of the camels who had carried him and his crew across many desert wastelands. He adjusted his aching body, ruffling the covers and creating sand dunes of linen in the pale fabric. Enormous dark birds of prey swooped down his long sleeves. Marco thought of the vultures that had hovered over the bloody scenes of his many battles. Death had been part of his adventure as well. and death was coming for him now. Marco shared another faint smile with his loving family. His wife Donata smiled back. She knew Marco had secured a place for himself in heaven. They had loved each other deeply and had raised three lovely daughters. Their two eldest daughters, Fantina and Belela, were now married. It seemed as if the youngest, Morera, might never marry, but it hardly mattered. No Polo daughter would ever know poverty. Even more important, Marco thought happily, they would know there was a world outside Venice. Marco put his hand to his heart, which was growing weaker. His fingers paused over a supple golden thread, the woven image of a smiling Kublai Khan. Khan, a Mongolian, had conquered China and ruled half the world. He had been the most powerful man on earth, and Marco had served him faithfully for nearly 20 years. Marco remembered sitting at the foot of the great man's marble throne, regaling him with stories of his travels throughout the great Mongol Empire. It was the Khan's own impending death 30 years ago that had finally sent Marco and his relatives on a long journey back to Venice. Kublai Khan was revered as a god, so no one spoke openly of his illness, but the Polos could tell that he was growing weaker by the day. Kublai Khan had specially liked Marco and his stories, and that had kept all the Polos in the ruler's favor. But there was no guarantee the next emperor would share the Khan's fondness for foreigners. They needed to get away before he died. Then the Khan announced that he needed trusted emissaries to deliver one of his princesses to Persia for an arranged royal marriage. The Polos volunteered. Khan, perhaps sensing the situation, reluctantly agreed. They said good-bye and left the Khan's palace behind. Not long into their journey, word came that their patron had indeed died in his sleep. Marco coughed again. This time a trickle of blood formed in his lips. Peter, his Mongol servant, gently placed a handkerchief on Marco's mouth and wiped the blood away. Peter had always been there for Marco. He'd been his personal assistant in Asia, and had remained with him ever since. He had even stayed by Marco's side during the long and terrible journey from home from Asia. Marco shuddered, but it wasn't the pain this time. It was the memory of that horrible voyage. That had been Marco's one great disaster. Along with the princess, he had also allowed a deadly cargo on board. Hundreds of his crew had died. It had been his fault. It had all been his fault. Thankfully, only he and Peter knew the truth about what had really happened, and in the years since, they had taken great pains to keep that secret safe. Now he tried to share one final look with Peter. Marco had asked him to perform one last task, a task that would keep the past hidden forever. He stared at Peter, but Peter seemed to be looking at Morera. Was he avoiding Marco's glance? Marco felt his weak heart leap. Had Peter not done what he'd asked? The horror of the thought gripped him. He lifted his head and looked at Peter again, pleading for reassurance. This time Peter caught his eye and smiled. He nodded yes. Marco lay back on his bed, relieved. Peter had done it. He had destroyed the final record of that journey. He felt ashamed that he'd ever doubted him. The world would never know the truth. He could die in peace. The priest must have sensed the end was near. He leaned in close again and whispered into Marco's ear, "Signor Polo, is there anything you'd like to confess? And lies you have told?" Marco laughed and coughed and laughed again. The people of Venice had loved his stories, but they'd never really believed him when he described all the wonderful and terrible things he'd seen. They scoffed when he told them of giant birds and rocks that burned and oil that seeped from the ground. As he felt his spirit leaving his body, he raised his head and uttered his last words. "I have told only half of what I have seen." Marco Polo's lifeless body fell back onto the sheets. The great explorer had left on his final journey. Venice, 1 year ago. Antonio Fusilli looked up from his desk. Someone had just entered his inner sanctum, the Marco Polo library at the Museo di Arte Orientale in Venice, and Antonio was not impressed. First of all, this was a private library, with visits by appointment only. Then there was the way the person was dressed. His or her face, head and body were completely hidden behind a large fedora scarf and trench coat. "Do you not know this is spring?" Fusilli called through the open office door. "Why do you dress so ridiculously?" Antonio himself was impeccably dressed, as always, and this person offended his fashion standards. The figure turned toward him, but said nothing. "Please leave," Antonio said. This place was more than an office for him. He was, after all, a descendant of Marco Polo. This was sacred ground. Again the figure said nothing, but this time a gloved hand emerged from the coat, holding a thick wad of euros. Antonio relaxed his standards and rules a little. He got up from behind his desk and walked into the main hallway. "Why do you offer me such a generous amount of cash?" he smiled. "I want the book." The voice was soft and scratchy. Antonio couldn't tell if it was coming from a man, a woman, or even a child. "Book? What book?" Antonio shrugged, looking around. "This is a library. We have hundreds of books." The figure grabbed Antonio by the neck and leaned in close to his face. The person was wearing a carnival mask. "Outrageous." "Bruto," the voice croaked. "Paula's secret notebook, you idiot. The one that he wrote on his journey home from China." Antonio felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Polo decided the story of that journey was of no value. Antonio lied. The figure hissed through the scarf. "Silencio! You know that he kept a notebook, and that it survived." The hold on Antonio's collar tightened menacingly. Antonio gasped as his throat constricted. "If you kill me, you will never find it." "So you admit it exists?" The figure let go. Antonio grabbed his throat, nodding his head in affirmation. "Yes, it exists," he said. "You can have one look for 5 minutes, but it will cost you twice the euros you have offered." Without flinching, the figure unrolled an even larger packet of bills and placed it in Antonio's hand. "This is 4 times as much," said the voice, "for 15 minutes." Antonio took a deep breath. "Si, 15 minutes, but then you must leave and never come back." "Agreed." Antonio adjusted his tie. He gestured for his strange visitor to sit down in a small wooden chair. The chair looked ordinary enough, but it was actually the first step in Antonio's security system. The seat contained a sensor. If someone sitting there stood up, the sudden loss of weight would set off an alarm, summoning the police. "Wait here and don't move," Antonio said. He made his way down a hall lined with bookcases. A vault door stood at the far end. Antonio looked back. The figure was sitting in the chair reading a book. Antonio took out a ring with 3 golden keys. He inserted the first key into the vault door. With a click of metal on metal, the door slid open. Antonio looked back again. The figure was still seated reading another book. Antonio stepped inside the vault, letting the door almost close behind him. Then he gently lifted the edge of an ornate Persian rug. Underneath was a trapdoor. The second key opened that. Resting inside the secret compartment was a golden box. It was decorated with emerald eye angels and mermaids, delicately wrought sundials, diamond-studded wind roses, and carved sailing ships. Any thief who'd managed to get this far would grab that beautiful box thinking it was a treasure. That, however, would be a mistake. The box was bolted to the floor. Tugging it would release a spring-loaded knife. Antonio chuckled. "Aim right at il cuore," the heart. The golden figures that adorned the top of the box were actually a clever combination lock. Antonio turned the arms on the wind roses and the sun-dial to the combination that he alone knew. With a click, the lid opened. Antonio pulled out the final key and placed it inside the lock on a small plain tin box that lay inside. He turned the key and opened the lid. Antonio leaned down and carefully lifted out the real treasure, a tiny leather notebook. For centuries his family had kept it hidden from the outside world. The great Marco's servant, Peter, had burned the original according to Marco's instructions. But Peter had also betrayed his master's wishes and made a copy. Actually, he'd made two, one for himself in his own Mongol language, and one in Italian for Moretta, the Polo daughter he dearly loved. Ah, amore, Antonio sighed, carefully touching the cover. You can be so cruel. Moretta had had jewels and wealth. Peter had wanted to give her something no other suitor could offer, a glimpse into a part of her father's past that he alone knew. But when Moretta read the notebook and discovered the terrible secret that lay within, she had rejected Peter's love token and Peter himself. Heartbroken, Peter had returned to Asia and disappeared, along with his copy of the notebook. Then it was Moretta's turn to be heartbroken. She realized, too late, that she had rejected the one man she truly loved. And as much as she had hated the story the notebook told, Moretta could not bring herself to destroy it. It was her only link to the man she had lost forever. Antonio knelt on the floor of the vault, holding the family heirloom. With my heirloom is an object that has remained in your family from generation to generation, has been inherited. It can be a watch, it could be a book, it could be cloth. With my apologies, dearest ancestor Moretta, I will now use this to secure my retirement. Antonio knew that no one could unlock the notebook's secret in a mere 15 minutes. He would end the day rich, and the mysterious figure would end the day disappointed. Antonio stood up and turned around. He stopped cold. The visitor blocked the vault's doorway, a gun sticking out from underneath a large trench coat. Santa Maria! Gasped Antonio, staring past the barrel of the gun and back down the hallway to the empty chair. Except it wasn't empty. There was a neat pile of books where the visitor was supposed to be sitting. How? Antonio gawked. Simple, the figure grasped. I added one book after another as I slowly lifted myself off the chair. I happened to be an expert in weights and measures. Antonio had to think quickly. He glanced around the room, trying not to let his panic show. There was one last alarm he could trigger, a button near the trapdoor. And what will you do with the notebook? He asked, inching toward the opening. You'll have to find out in the afterlife. Ciao, said the figure as it pulled the trigger. Antonio made a final lunge toward the alarm. The bullet narrowly missed the precious book, but it did not miss Antonio's heart. He fell dead, his finger just grazing the button. Alarms rang out and the vault door began to close. The figure leapt over to Antonio's body, grabbed the notebook and the money, and narrowly made it back through the door before it slammed shut. By the time the police arrived, the strange visitor was long gone. Chapter 1. Salmon or Salmonella?